No.
The Nintendo Switch eShop has proven to be a sort of dumping grounds for all sorts of digital exclusive games. With the amount of new content that gets released each week, it's almost impossible to keep track of it all, especially in the midst of all the big-name physical releases. Personally, I'd like to actually try out a few of these obscure games and hopefully find something buried beneath all those releases. So this time, I'm taking a look at Whipseey and the Lost Atlas. Whipseey and the Lost Atlas is a game that caught my eye on the eShop's Coming Soon page. The graphics look vibrant and the artwork is appealing, but the low price point of just $6 is what ultimately pushed me over the edge to pre-purchase the game. The game begins with a quick cutscene that attempts to explain the game's backstory, but I don't exaggerate when I say quick. Each frame goes by so fast, I barely have time to process what's happening. From what I can surmise, the main character, who's named Alex according to the eShop description, gets sucked into a magic book which I can only assume is the titular Lost Atlas, though it doesn't look very lost. Upon getting sucked in, Alex transformed into a pink ball named Whipseey, and some faceless chick in a pink dress gives him a fancy new whip and sends him off on his merry way. How nice of her. Then the game truly begins and you're given immediate control over Whipseey. The first thing I notice is, of course, how stunningly beautiful the pixel graphics are. The game just looks so clean and vibrant. This is what drew me to the game in the first place, but actually playing the game and seeing it in motion definitely made my eyes light up. To address the pink elephant in the room, yes, the game is clearly heavily inspired by the Kirby series, at least from a visual standpoint, with a multitude of enemies practically taken straight out of Kirby's Adventure and a main character that looks just like you-know-who. Though, personally, I feel like Whipseey looks more like the missing link between Jigglypuff and Wigglytuff. While the game does little to hide its visual inspiration, the gameplay is a different story. Whipseey can do exactly 3 things with his magic whip. He can whip enemies, of course, which will be your single method of attack for the entire game, and he can also latch his whip onto grapple points to swing across gaps, similar to Simon Belmont's famous ability from Super Castlevania 4. Finally, he can slow his descent by spinning his whip like a helicopter, which is functionally similar to the cape power-up from Super Mario World, only Whipseey never loses access to this ability. The game also sets itself apart from Kirby with its difficulty level. I wouldn't necessarily call Whipseey and the Lost Atlas a hard game outside of a few instances, but you will die quite a few times. In just the first level, I found myself losing repeatedly in an underwater segment full of instant death spikes. This is where I got my first game over. Thankfully, the game has a very generous checkpoint system where you'll respawn in the same room or area where you lost a life. You start off with 5 lives and earn a new life by collecting 100 of the gems that are dropped by enemies upon defeat. A game over means you have to start the level over from the beginning, which isn't as harsh as it sounds since the levels in this game are all fairly short and they're usually pretty fun. After defeating the first boss, which I felt provided an appropriate challenge, you move on to the second level, a forest stage that continues the trend of great art design. The music here is also worth calling attention to. While the game's mechanics aren't hard to grasp, Whipseey still does a commendable job of teaching players the basics. In level 1, the first grapple points you come across are situated over water, so you can freely practice your ability without fear of falling in a pit or some other deadly trap. In the same level, you'll find a platform that's just a bit too far to reach with a regular jump. This is the first instance where use of your helicopter whip is mandatory. Later, in the second level, you'll find this frog enemy that's placed in an area where your whip can't reach him and you can't jump over him. This is likely where many players will discover that you can jump on enemies' heads to stun them. Level 2 also introduces a couple more Kirby-inspired enemies, namely one that electrifies his own body to attack, and the one that balances on a giant apple, but at this point I found the game to strike a good balance between original concepts and one that simply pay homage to another series. In fact, level 3 has nothing but functionally unique enemies, but unfortunately, that's about the only positive thing I can say about level 3. Whipseey's third level does away with its colorful vibrancy and instead settles for a desert theme full of shades of brown, complete with an underwhelming music track. It's not particularly appealing, though I may be biased considering how long I spent in this level. It's not long before you come across the dreaded Sombrero Waddle Dee. This freaking guy is the worst. This game suffers from its weird fetish for cheaply placing enemies at the very edge of small platforms situated over bottomless pits. I mentioned before how generous a game is with its checkpoints and lives, so a few cheap deaths sprinkled throughout usually isn't a big deal, but these sombrero Waddle Dees are just terrible. They're placed at the edge of platforms at a very particular elevation relative to the player, so that you can't jump high enough to stun them or jump over them. They're also meticulously positioned so that you can't jump up and whip them from below. So basically, the game is asking you to jump towards them at a very specific height and time your whip attack mid-air so that you can defeat them just before landing in their spot. And you have to do this multiple times in a row without messing up once. And forget about taking your time and premeditating your jump. These fiends throw explosives at you when you approach them. Now, I'm not going to sit here and pretend that this is one of the hardest challenges in the history of video games or something like that. I've played my way through some truly sinister levels in my day, but it's another instance later on in the same level that really puts my patience in this game to the test. There's this section where you have to make it over one platform to the next by jumping on a floating enemy's head to achieve extra jump height. It should be so simple. It's something you do all the time in Mario games, but for whatever reason, every time I try to jump on the enemy, I would either take damage because of the game's poor hit detection, or I would manage to jump off the enemy and still not make it to the platform anyways. This is in no way a fair challenge. In fact, I would bet this wasn't even intended to be as hard as it was. Someone screwed up during development. I easily died more times from this room than any other area, enemy, or boss in the game. And what happens when you get a game over? You guessed it, back to grinding your way through that unholy gauntlet of sombrero Waddle Dees. With most challenging games, the player gains skill through repetition, but this is only somewhat true with the nonsense I had to deal with in this level. Sure, I got better at killing these guys, but it still never felt right. I never found that groove you get in a game like Mega Man or Castlevania. Back to the waterfall pit enemy. After more game overs than I could keep track of, I finally miraculously made it to the other side. I felt like jumping for joy, but that sense of victory was short-lived, for I had a sneaking suspicion that was confirmed the moment I moved to the next area. What if we took this next to impossible jumping challenge and made you do it again, but this time with double the anguish? And now, when you run out of lives, you get to fight your way through the forces of Satan again, and try to make the next to impossible jump again, and then do it again. Oh, what am I even doing with my life? When I finally made it to the boss, and don't ask me how I managed to do that, I played more carefully than I ever have before to ensure my victory. It's almost as if the developers knew the player would spend so much more time trudging their way through level 3, because level 4 is decidedly fast-paced, complete with an action-packed auto-scrolling set-piece atop a moving train. The 4th level on the whole is extremely refreshing, with no cheap deaths to be found. I was especially grateful for this game's pastel color palette, which is a wonderful sight to behold after watching the browns of the desert gradually become more and more vomit-esque with each passing minute. I should mention, the boss battles in this game are all very enjoyable, and while I think they could afford to be, dare I say it, a little more challenging, I still find them to be among the game's highlights. By the time I reached the 5th level, my bitterness induced by the desert stage was all but gone, and I found myself thoroughly enjoying the game again. Level 5 is perhaps my favorite level of the bunch. At this point, the game almost seems to have forgotten its source of inspiration, because level 5 is unashamedly inspired by Bowser's Castle, complete with Whipseey variants of dry bones and thwomps, and of course an abundance of lava pits and lava bubbles. That's not to say the game completely abandoned its love for Kirby, as both Sword Knight and Sir Kibble make cameo appearances. Level 5, like most of Whipseey and the Lost Atlas, has a great visual style, and is overall a decently designed level with an adequate amount of challenge and a good sense of flow to it. The music track in particular is, as the kids say, an absolute banger. It's a shame that just as the game was finally finding its stride, it abruptly ends. That's right, this game only has 5 stages. When you beat the final boss, which I won't spoil, but it's the guy in the artwork, you get another cutscene that flashes by as quickly as the first one, and then you're sent back to the title screen before having a chance to catch your breath. I really want to like Whipseey and the Lost Atlas. It has so much going for it. A fun gameplay hook, incredible pixel art, great music, memorable boss battles. For $6, I can easily recommend a game that takes less than half the time to beat than it did for me to write this review. Personally, I'm fine with short games that I can beat in one sitting. I have no shortage of lengthy games to play through. But what sets this game apart from similarly cheap and bite-sized games like Kirby's Dream Land or Super Mario Land is, and I hate to beat a dead Waddle Dee, Level freaking 3. This game's desert level, with all its problems, straight up demolishes any chance of me replaying this game versus its contemporaries, and makes it difficult for me to push this game onto other unsuspecting people. That sadistic level had no reason to be as annoying as it was, considering prior and subsequent levels are all so fun to play. The difficulty spike feels less like a creative choice and more like an example of something being overlooked in the code, namely the hit detection. I can pretend all I want that the rest of this game was a perfectly fine little experience, but the game is littered with instances where you'll die cheap deaths thanks to dumb moments such as bumping your head on an invisible corner or missing that detestable flying waterfall enemy. The game's checkpoint system and generous amount of extra lives do a ton to alleviate the frustration from these issues, but nevertheless, the issues are still there. Whipseey and the Lost Atlas needed a bit more time in development to fix these niggling problems. Ideally, the game would benefit from having twice the amount of levels, but even a short hour-long game would be just fine thanks to its replayability. But I can't imagine anyone would want to replay this game after enduring that cheap difficulty spike that plagues the game's midpoint. In spite of all my negativity, I'd be lying if I said the game wasn't a pretty fun experience throughout, level 3 notwithstanding. I would love to see these developers learn from their experience and make something even better, because Whipseey and the Lost Atlas was so close to hitting that home run. Oh, and special shout out to these guys, they're the real heroes. Thanks a ton for watching this video. Did you know I had to write this review twice? Being the absolute genius that I am, I managed to save over the Word document of my review of Wonder Boy Monsterland. Seeing how Whipseey was the first review I wrote, it was pretty devastating when I realized that all that time and effort was wasted. Luckily, I was able to muster up the willpower to rewrite this entire thing from scratch, so hopefully it paid off and I get a few likes at the very least. And here's to more videos in the near future. Thanks again, from me and my unwanted dog, Isabel.